a type of towards an approach to doing therapy. Like we can have countertransference towards limited gambling as a goal or harm reduction as an approach. And as with other kinds of countertransference, that doesn't make us bad clinicians, for having those feelings. The important thing is to acknowledge them and decide, what am I going to do with this? Isn't that interesting? What role can that play, and how can I learn from my feelings as they're coming up? So hopefully that makes sense and will make sense as we delve into these topics. And right from the get-go, a handy-dandy poll. So let me get this poll going here. Whoop. I was practicing, and I hope I can. Oh, oh, I don't know if I can do this. Relaunch poll. Okay. When I was practicing it, it wants me to share results, and I want to relaunch it. So hopefully you've got the poll and you can respond to the poll. I'll give people a few minutes to do that. What do you think the primary goal of problem gambling treatment should be? Abstinence, stopping all gambling behavior, reducing gambling behavior, or reducing the harms? Wow. And please, this is anonymous, so don't feel like you have to give the right answer for this webinar. Take a moment and think what you really believe. What do you want the client's primary goal to be, whether or not it is? What would you like it to be? All right. Looks like we've got a good number of people responding. So let me end and share results. Okay, so the vast majority of you, reducing the harm associated with gambling behaviors as the primary goal. And about 12% at stopping all gambling behavior, 8% reducing all gambling behavior. So thank you for responding to that. And, not that it's a right answer, it's just a way of thinking about what in my heart of hearts and in the deepest crevices of my mind do I really think my client should have as a goal. And certainly when I started in the field, it was just a given. We didn't even think about it, that somebody coming in for gambling treatment, the goal was to get them to stop all of their gambling. And with Gamblers Anonymous, this is a program for people who want to stop gambling. It says that in their materials, in their books, anybody who has a desire to stop gambling. Over time, we've come to expand that a little bit, and it took wrapping my head around that. And that there are different things to think about, and we think of each of these things differently in terms of reducing harms, limiting gambling, or stopping gambling. 3 different aspects of where we focus when we're engaging with our clients. And another poll. So let me quickly set this up. Launch. Okay. Abstinence-based and limited gambling approaches are both harm reduction approaches. True, false. So you guys are good. Responding very quickly here. All right. Both harm reduction. All right, a few more responses coming in. Great. Come on. All right, let me end that poll and share the results. Okay, so about 70% say that's true and 30% say that's false. Yeah, and I think, let me stop that. Okay. And for a lot of years, and I think commonly, harm reduction is talked about, and many people assume when we're talking about harm reduction, we're only talking about limited gambling approaches or that they're synonymous. Harm reduction only applies when somebody is still gambling. And I've really come to understand that that's not true, that abstinence, when we worked on abstinence or no gambling with clients, we were working at harm reduction along the way. How can you address the harm that these activities, these gambling activities, have brought to your life in terms of emotional harms, relational harms, financial harms? So we're doing harm reduction regardless of whether the client's goals are to stop gambling or not gambling excessively or problematically. So both abstinence and limited gambling approaches involve harm reduction. That's the bigger umbrella. So what are we talking about here? And a kind of global definition is harm reduction is a public health alternative model to the moral, criminal, and disease models of addiction. And I love this poster. Harm reduction values life, keeping people alive, regardless of whether they're engaged in an addictive behavior or not. Their choices, having respect and compassion for the people we're working with over judgment, stigma, discrimination, and punishment. And breaking that down a bit more, this is an umbrella term, as we've talked about, the big umbrella for interventions aiming to reduce the harmful, problematic effects of behavior, such as gambling. It can be thought of as a philosophy as well as a set of actions or practices. So it's both a way of thinking and understanding as well as a way of interacting, relating to, and practicing. It's often grounded in what's been called compassionate pragmatism. And compassion, we all think we know what compassion is. But let me just differentiate between empathy and compassion. Empathy is feeling with an individual. I feel your pain. I feel there, and I tap into a place in me that's experienced something akin to what your experience is, so I can resonate with how you're feeling. I can tap into my losses to have empathy for your grief, for example. We can get empathy fatigue because if all we're doing is feeling with people in pain, we're going to burn out. Compassion may begin with empathy, but what we add to that is a wishing for, as well as the effort towards relief from that pain. So there's hope in compassion. Compassion wishes an individual an end to their suffering and brings with it a willingness to put in effort to help them get that relief. And certainly isn't that what counseling is about? So that compassion, wishing people have relief from their struggle, from their difficulties, from their suffering, from their stress, in a very practical way. Does this work? Is it effective? Is it doable? Is it achievable? It's not some idealistic thing that's kind of pie in the sky-ish, or overly optimistic or overly Pollyanna-ish. No, it's like, oh, let's get in there in the muck and see what works without, the ideal, maybe nobody has a gambling addiction. Not practical, not going to happen. The ideal might be that, all of my clients reach all of their goals and get rid of all their problems around their gambling. Doesn't seem to work that way. People struggle and have difficulties. So what's practical and workable? And in the doing promotes collaboration, not just based on my lofty ideals or goals, but collaborating, meeting the client where they're at. And as we've talked about, includes abstinence as well as limited gambling approaches. I had one lovely young counselor, and every time think you've heard it all, who during a break kind of, comes up to me and says, but if my client wants to stop gambling, is it okay if I work on that? Yes, I'm sorry if I've gone overboard on talking about limited gambling. Yes, no problem with that. And this approach often has as an underpinning a human rights agenda, a commitment to bringing effective treatment to marginalized groups that have traditionally been denied quality care. And if you've worked in substance use and mental health, you know that mental health in general seems to be, the odd person out in terms of funding and resources in the medical and healthcare profession. And among all the behavioral health disorders, addictive disorders seem to be, the stepchild of the mental health disorders. So we're dealing with marginalized groups. And then within that, substance use and mental health, there are even more marginalized groups, homeless individuals, those with...
I can still talk.
Please make sure you have yourself muted. Thank you. So we know the marginalized groups, those at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, those, on Medicaid. We don't necessarily always talk about it, but there's not necessarily equity of care. We have data to show that people of color get different attitudes and treatment and unconscious bias within the healthcare universe. And harm reduction seeks to reduce the harm of those biases as well as reduce the harm of behaviors people are engaged in. And scientific, we are committed to evidence-based interventions, or evidence-informed. Certainly we don't have all the research to, say everything we need to do is evidence-based, but at least make it evidence-informed, not idiosyncratic to this is the way Lori likes to do things. And that does address the issue of abstinence-based approaches as, an only way of intervening. There's absolutely no evidence that says that that's the most effective way of intervening with clients with a gambling disorder or other addictive disorders. So let's look at the evidence of what does work in people's lives. Reducing the harm associated with a behavior is a primary goal, rather than reducing or stopping the behavior, and the vast majority of you pick that option as a primary goal. And when we think about how do we intervene with clients, what do we talk about with our clients, what do we monitor with our clients? Are we just monitoring their gambling behaviors, how much time, money, and so forth they're spending? Or are we helping them look at other aspects of their life, and how the harms are being reduced, and how that may be connected to frequency of gambling activities? And we support any small steps in the direction of less harm and more well-being. And we really validate and reinforce those steps. We're on the path, we're in the process. How do we know if we're going in the right direction? By looking at these incremental improvements in how we're feeling, how we're relating, how we're paying bills, and realizing ultimate goals may not be attainable, at least in the short term. And we know relapses are part of the picture, reoccurrences of behaviors or excessive behaviors. So the ultimate goal, yes, that's great. But let's not ignore the interim goals that we are achieving. And within the harm reduction framework, my goals are secondary, to what the client wants. Let me check my goals at the door and listen to and collaborate with what the client's goals are. Now I can give feedback on those goals. I can have input, but I'm not imposing my goals or my program's goals. Oftentimes, when I work with agencies and organizations, I'll ask, is your organization an abstinence-based organization? Well, if you say yes, that means your organization is imposing its goals on your clients. It might be better to think of an organization or a practice as a recovery-based, which leaves room for anybody's individual definition of what that recovery looks like to them. So I hope that makes sense. Let me just take a pause and see if people are chatting in any questions. I'll try to check in occasionally. All right. I don't see any, but if Rachel and Colleen can monitor any burning questions that come in and catch my attention, that'd be great.
We will.
Wonderful. So kind of moving from those basic definitions, and again, think about them. Is this new? Do you agree with that? Do you not understand what that means? Or does something resonate with you? We can look at various levels of how harm reduction is applied. From a population prevention level, that really is the public health approach that gets out harm reduction messages to whole communities, whole populations. And also considers the public health environment. In other words, how do factors outside of the person who gambles control influence their likelihood of experiencing harm? Now, what does that mean? What's a factor outside my control? Well, my ethnicity is outside my control. The neighborhood into which I was born is outside my control. My family history of mental health or addictions is outside control. Whether the nation is having a recession, at least from my level of pay grade, is outside my control. You know, so all these things in my environment are outside my control. I may vote on whether or not to have sports betting in my community, but once it's here, it's pretty much outside my control. So, you know, the kind of schools in my community, all of these things that can affect my likelihood of experiencing harm. We know that one of the major factors, risk factors for somebody developing a gambling problem is living in a disadvantaged neighborhood. Level of unemployment, level of education, level of income. All of those things that go into defining that affect the likelihood of somebody experiencing a gambling problem. So that's that public health level of prevention and intervention, and trying to minimize harm by addressing those things outside the individual's control. Individual focused health promotion, looking at risk individuals and how can we minimize their potential for harm from gambling activities. And we know what those at-risk groups are: people with mental health and substance use disorders. You know, depending on your community, it may be ethnicity. Again, it's whatever group is most disadvantaged in that community. In some communities, it's African American. In some communities, it's Latinx or Hispanic. In other communities, it might be, other countries, it might be the Maori, you know, or other ethnic groups. And then in terms of healthcare, you know, what are the interventions that reduce the harm of those people already experiencing problems from gambling? And I'll say a little bit in the next few slides about that kind of universal level of prevention and attitudes, and then we'll move towards looking at the individual clinical harm reduction treatment and then at-risk groups a bit. So we've probably all seen some of these messages, you know, in other areas about harm reduction. It's really becoming more a part of our language. You know, if you're going to drink, don't drive, have a designated driver, you know what your limits are in terms of drinking. Naloxone messages, you know, how to prevent an overdose, not how to cure somebody of their addiction to opiates and fentanyl, but how to use naloxone if somebody seems to be having an overdose. You know, so this is a bottom-up approach that really took off during the AIDS and HIV epidemic, with, you know, starting with let's use not share needles, needle exchange programs. And we've expanded as we've wrapped our heads around one step, needle exchange, you know, programs, and maybe sites where you can learn how to inject more safely. Where you can test your drugs to know what it is you're taking to reduce the harm. So lots of approaches that, when I started in the field, would have been totally sacrilegious. And it's been a fight to include these in our practices. So the water in which we live, there's a story where there's fish swimming around, and there are two young fish with an older fish passing by. And the older fish says to the two youngsters, "How's the water today?" And the two young fish look at each other quizzically and say, "What's water?" The point of the story being, we don't often recognize the environment in which we live and where our attitudes come from. So we need to be aware of the water, what's around us, what's conditioned our thinking and our reactions to things like gambling and limited gambling. One of the things that's been in the water for a long time now is this play responsibly, phrase that you see, if you go to casinos or lottery things, it may say, "Please play responsibly." It's really become pretty ubiquitous. It's the water in which we swim. But what does that really mean? It's putting responsibility on the consumer, and it comes from this consumer self-responsibility model. It sees gambling as just another service product or consumer good that's offered by the market, and consumers will maximize their utility. What the heck does that mean? It means they'll make rational decisions in their own best interest. It equates to as if I was going out and buying a car, and I did my due diligence to get the best deal on a car. And I went to the dealer that gave me the best deal, and I made a rational decision about, what product to get, what kind of car I needed to meet my needs, and how to pay the lowest amount possible. That assumption that consumers of gambling services are always rational may be a faulty assumption. Are consumers of gambling products making rational choices? When we look at brain imaging and see that, the brains of anybody who's gambling will gamble more when there are more near misses, and our brains are getting hijacked to gamble more than is in our best interest if I almost won. Or if there are multiple line slot machines that have the bells and whistles going off, even if I'm never winning more than I put in, and I'm always losing a little bit every time the bells and whistles go off, my brain is getting hijacked. And certainly if I'm somebody at risk for a gambling problem, my brain may be more prone to getting hijacked by this activity and not making rational decisions. It assumes consumers are informed, rational agents. So if we just give people more information, they'll make better decisions. So if I explain to somebody with a gambling problem what the odds are of winning, they'll of course no longer be a problem gambler. Well, my clients know more about the odds than I ever want to. So it's not just giving more information and having better informed consumers that's going to solve this issue. Emphasizes the freedom and responsibility of the individual. If you have a gambling problem, you have to make better decisions. Well, we can agree on that to some extent, but what about the other side of the equation? And we'll talk a bit about that later. What's the responsibility of the seller of the product, of those in the gambling industry, to look at the addictive nature of their products, a la the cigarette industry, for example. So it's not as one-sided as responsible gambling programs might have us believe. The Reno model has been a model that's been supported for many years. And its premises is that there are safe levels of gambling participation are possible. And certainly that goes along with limited gambling approaches, that it's like drinking. Some people can drink, some people can gamble without it ever causing a problem. Gambling provides recreation, social, and economic benefit to individuals and communities. We're not very good at measuring that, especially compared to the harms. So we've got a ways to go there. Do the benefits outweigh the harms? We don't have great data to establish that. Provide evidence-based responsible gambling interventions to inform players. Again, it's based on that consumer, rational consumer model. And we're not really studying what those evidence-based interventions might be. For example, how fast a rate of play is too fast, because we know the faster the reinforcement, the more people are likely to play and the more they're likely to lose. If we slow it down, how can that help people reduce the harm of their gambling? We don't have good studies on that. Total social benefits must exceed total costs. Do we know currently that the social benefits of gambling are exceeding the social costs? We don't have good studies on that. Some places are doing a little bit better. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Sweden are gathering some data to make more evidence-based choices. We're not doing a great job here of that in the US, and could do a whole lot better. All right, so that's kind of that public health, view from the broadest sense model. That's the water in which we're swimming. Okay, with that kind of perspective, that it's the individual's fault, and it's up to them to do something about it in terms of harm reduction, without really looking at how whole communities, jurisdictions, and the industry need to be involved in the harm reduction process. So let's talk about, well, what are the harms of gambling? Well, there have been studies to look at that, not huge numbers, but I think most people can agree that there are harms in a whole range of domains. Often what gets talked about most clinically, and in terms of prevention interventions, are the financial costs on individuals who gamble excessively. We also have research now that there are health-related problems, cardiovascular problems, gastrointestinal problems, obesity, poor healthcare practices in individuals' life who gamble more than the average. Depression, anxiety, very common harms. Exacerbation of existing mental health problems, exacerbation of psychotic disorders, for example, as well as exacerbation and aggravation of depression. Relationship breakdown, separation, divorces, isolation, conflict, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, lots of issues in relationships. Also affecting relationships and families in terms of impact on the kids, who have greater degrees of depression, anxiety, poor performance in schools, and so forth. Family members' health and well-being suffers, not just mental health, but physical health as well. Workplace costs, not just the embezzlement from the workplace, but loss of worker productivity, greater unemployment, bankruptcy. Don't have enough data because nobody's asking in bankruptcy court, but we know high rates of bankruptcy, evictions, foreclosures, increased rates of homelessness, criminal activities around gambling behaviors, and very high rates of suicide, nearly 20% suicide attempts among those with a gambling disorder. And another thing that we'll talk about is when we talk about these harms, a lot of the research is focused on the tip of the iceberg, the harms that accrue to people who are diagnosed with a gambling disorder. And that's the smallest tip of the iceberg. What we need to look at, and we'll talk a bit about this, is what are the harms that are experienced by individuals who have gambling even less than would be diagnosable as having a gambling disorder. We have to consider those harms as well. And this were studies on those living with an individual or caring about an individual who has a gambling disorder. And you see the impact on concerned others, certainly the financial problems that affect their financial well-being, the family's financial well-being, not just that of the person with the gambling issues. Family members, concerned others may experience more alcohol abuse, greater levels of anger, depression, conflict, feeling hopeless, anxious. Women particularly report social isolation. Men worry about job loss. This is impacting my work. I'm getting called by creditors. I may lose my job. Obsessive compulsive symptoms, being obsessive and compulsive about where the money is, where my loved one is, checking, doubting oneself. So getting more obsessive and compulsive about just making sure everything's where it needs to be. And stress-related problems like sleep, headaches, sick days, GI problems, breathing problems, that whole gamut. So that's the range of harms that people with some level of problematic gambling, as well as those in relationship to those individuals, experience. And here's where we talk about the difference between that diagnosable tip of the iceberg and those who are gambling less problematically, but still experiencing harms. It's called the prevention paradox. A large number of people exposed to low risk is likely to produce more cases of harm than a small number of people exposed to a high risk. So if you have, say, 1% of the population who meet criteria for a gambling disorder, and you look at those harms, it says, oh, well, that's 1%, so they have a lot of harm. It's only 1%. But then if you look at folks who may be just gambling or experiencing, one criteria for a gambling disorder, and that suddenly is 12% of the population, and you start looking at the level of harms they're experiencing, there's a lot more people. So it's a cumulatively much more harm. Let me show you a picture of that may make more sense. This was a lovely study, and they looked at all the possible harms they could think of somebody might experience as a result of their gambling. And they broke them down into categories: financial, health-related, relationships, work, emotional, and deviance, which is mostly criminal activities. And then they had all the folks who responded to, have you ever experienced this harm as a result of your gambling and broke them down to responsible gambling, had no symptoms of gambling problems, low risk, a few symptoms, moderate risk, and those who might be meeting criteria for problem gambling. So level of severity. So the darker the block, the more severe the gambling problem, from no gambling problem to significant gambling problem. And when you look at financial harms, nearly 50% of all the financial harms endorsed were endorsed by people who had no signs of a gambling problem. They gambled, but they didn't meet any criteria. So this is what we mean by more harms being experienced by those individuals at low risk for a problem. So we have to broaden our understanding of gambling-related harms to not just those people who have a defined gambling problem, but people who gamble, and understand that more clearly. And particularly if we're working with higher risk groups like people in substance use or mental health treatment, we want to provide some interventions that, again, help anybody, even those who don't meet any criteria for a gambling problem, realize that they can be harmed, they can experience some of these harms, and what can we do about that? Okay, another poll. Are you ready? Let me put that up there. Launch. Okay. So how comfortable are you working with a client on an abstinence goal? A client says, I just want to stop gambling. Extremely comfortable, somewhat comfortable, uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable. Oh, you guys are so good. You're getting those answers in there quickly. All right. Okay, so sharing results. So most folks are pretty comfortable, from somewhat to extremely comfortable working with somebody on a I want to stop gambling goal. Great. Now let's quickly go to the next poll, which is our last poll of the day. So you can relax after this one. How comfortable are you working with a client on a limited gambling goal? All right. Okay, a few more coming in. Okay, let me end the poll and share results. Okay, not totally different. A few more extremely uncomfortable or uncomfortable. A few less extremely comfortable, but most folks in that somewhat to extremely comfortable range. Okay. Thank you so much for that. So that water in which we swim in our cultural conditioning around limited gambling versus abstinence. I know, at least as I grew up in the field of addiction, the water in which we were swimming included, droplets of things like enabling. So working with somebody on continuing to engage in the behavior, even if in a limited way, often got labeled as enabling, which was something not too cool to be doing with our clients or with loved ones. And tough love means, you stop it. And the emphasis was on the tough, not on the love necessarily. And if you weren't ready, then you had to hit a lower bottom. And if you were still gambling in any way, shape, or form, you just had to go out there and do more research and hit a lower bottom to be ready to deal with this, because clearly you were in denial if you still wanted to gamble at all. So a lot of stigmatizing language in that water in terms of traditional approaches to looking at addiction, and saying lovely things to our clients like, take the cotton out of your ears and stuff it in your mouth. So listen to what I'm telling you. Listen to my goals because I know better. And your best thinking got you here, right? And labeling clients who wanted a goal other than the goal I had for them, they were just resistant clients. And that's still out there in the water. It takes a long time for these attitudes to change, and especially in realizing it's still in there, it's still in me. I may not act on it currently, but that conditioning is still there. And recognizing how it creeps in is really, really important. Now, folks who are younger than I am, which is probably a lot of you out there, may not have had the same kind of water. And, maybe you grew up more with motivational interviewing than traditional, types of addictions programming. But, so feel free to chat in other things that you're aware of, your cultural conditioning, and culture in terms of, your professional culture, the addiction recovery culture that you may have grown up with. If you've been a member of Gamblers Anonymous, that's a culture that's conditioned you about, limited gambling versus abstinence and harm reduction and what that means. So, feel free to put in the chat, what are the factors and influences you're aware of that may be part of your addiction cultural conditioning around these ideas. So, even to this day, and I have been a proponent of harm reduction for a lot of years. But when I work with a client, I'm always a bit more anxious in working on a limited gambling goal than an abstinence goal. There's that little part of my mind that says, should I be doing this? Am I enabling? And I check with colleagues more to make sure I'm on the right track, to make sure I'm not missing something, that it's okay to be doing this, that I'm not doing any harm to my client. And I realize it's illogical, but there's part of my conditioned thinking that says, well, gee, if you're helping this client to just limit their gambling, is it your fault if they gamble excessively and cause more harm? Are you somehow supporting that? Well, it's just as likely that somebody with whom I'm working on an abstinence-based goal will go back to gambling and cause themselves harm as someone I'm working on a limited gambling goal. So that there's no rational reason for my anxiety, but I have to appreciate that it's there. And I may need more support in working with clients on that premise.
I just walked back in.
Okay, somebody says, let's see some chats here. Asking first about working on abstinence versus working on limit gambling brought home for me my own bias. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Glad it worked that way. It makes people make a decision when they're better able to actually make a decision. Yeah. Individual basis, yes. Having a sense of integrity in what we are offering the client. Boy, and that's really important because this cultural conditioning can really influence what I feel I have integrity in offering. Do I believe that it does my client good to work with them where they're at in terms of their goal is limited gambling? What if I, in my heart of hearts, believe there's no way under God's blue sky that this is going to work for this person, that they really have to stop gambling completely? That really puts me in a bind, and we need to do, get some supervision, get some peer consultation. How do I work this through? Because this isn't about little Lori's integrity. It's about meeting my client where they're at and honoring their goals. Now, I can give them feedback, as I said, here are my concerns about what may make it difficult for you to gamble in a limited way. And so we have our integrity in that we voice our concerns, and that's where the integrity lies. Lovely comment. So I kept this in because this was a slide, so often, our slides need to be updated and we're going through a presentation and realize, oh, I didn't want to say that. That's outdated. So had happened any number of times with this slide where, 20 years ago, the slide read, harm reduction recognizes abstinence as the primary treatment goal and accepts alternatives that reduce harm. And over the years, I've changed that to recognizes abstinence as one of many treatment goals and embraces, not just accepts, but wholeheartedly embraces alternative goals that lead to reduced harm. So we've talked about some of this, but harm reduction allows for low threshold access. We can get people into services earlier. If abstinence is the only thing we offer, then people have to have gone through much pain, that hitting that bottom over and over again. Okay, I surrender. I'm willing to stop completely. We don't allow people to come in when they're just beginning to think of and contemplate, maybe I need to reduce the harms of my gambling. Don't want to give it up yet. Is there something I can do so that it doesn't create chaos in my life? Talked about bottom up rather than top down, compassionate pragmatism. Clients set their own rate of change. And that's the only rate that people change at. Nobody works at my pace except me. And we develop a not knowing stance. Gee, doc, do you think I can just limit my gambling? I don't know. And with authenticity, being willing to work with that client on their goal, not just until they crash and burn and they're willing to stop. And I'll just be a patient therapist and hold their hand through the process until they ultimately, surrender. No, we need to bring our best clinical skills to helping this client meet their goals in this moment. And it's not for use with only one age group or gender or ethnic group or type of client, anyone. And not, as I mentioned, only when all else fails. And we want to create an atmosphere conducive of change, supportive, non-judging, offering that menu of option, accepting clients' choices. If we say, what would you like your goal to be? Then we have to accept that. So, and we gain awareness. I gain awareness of what the client's reality is, and they gain awareness. And we continue to educate around potential risks that we may see that they may not be aware of. And in the process, the client sees the outcome of their own choices and their own behavior. We help offer alternative options to meet the needs that harmful behavior, they may think harmful behavior is meeting. We constantly revamp the goals based on current performance and realities, and we provide that ongoing feedback loop to the client. So let's look at Nick. Nick is a 36-year-old male, first marriage. He's been married for 6 years. They have 2 children, ages 2 and 4. He's gambled since he's been 14 years old, primarily on sports. His income is $100,000 a year. He has a gambling debt of $55,000 and getting behind on bills. There's increased marital conflict. He's noticed his drinking is increasing. He loves gambling and doesn't want to commit to total abstinence. He's willing to try limiting his gambling and really does want to reduce the harms that are starting to crop up. So step 1, what do we want to do with Nick? Well, first of all, it's good to help get a clearer understanding of gambling behavior at this baseline. You know, if you want to limit it, how do we establish what those limits are going to be and what makes sense? And how can we understand the purpose of gambling in your life? So we can offer a cost-benefit analysis. We can offer some self-monitoring, which often includes a functional analysis. So with Nick, imagine we've done a cost-benefit analysis, and he says, well, it's fun. I love the competition. I love the challenge, the camaraderie, and, you know, sometimes I win money, and that's fun. The cost, well, I have been spending too much. I'm feeling guilty and anxious, you know, especially with my spouse. We're arguing a lot more, and I feel ashamed at the money that I've lost and angry at myself that I can't be in better control. Okay, so, you know, first of all, really validate, thanks for being so honest and looking at both sides of this coin. You know, it sounds like you get some pretty significant benefits from this activity. And we want to keep those benefits either through this activity or other activities. Those are important things in life. Those are all really important things. It's so important to validate for our clients the benefits they're getting from the activity of gambling. Generally, nothing wrong with those benefits. They're things we all want in our life. But the cost side, you know, is that cost too much? Which of these costs or harms do we want to reduce? You know, well, I'd like to spend less money. I don't want to feel so guilty about engaging in this thing that used to be much more fun. I certainly don't want to keep arguing with my wife. And I don't want to be ashamed that I can't stick to my limits. Okay, and we can help you with that. There are things we can do to try to reduce those harms. But let's take a look first, Nick, at what your baseline is so we know what we're dealing with. So this would be a self-monitoring exercise and also the beginning of a functional analysis. When are you doing this? Where are you doing it? Who are you doing with? How are you feeling? So we're breaking down the behavior to understand it better. And then what's the effect? So Nick comes in with a lovely completion of his self-monitoring. So you just validate the heck out of that. Great job. You're really taking this seriously. That shows how, willing you are to try to address the harms and decrease the harms. And then you process that with Nick. Let's look at where you're doing this. And does it get more out of control in some places than others? The sports bar, you're drinking, you just got paid. That makes you feel pretty good, but you end up feeling pretty bad. So you give the client feedback and first asking, well, what do you make of this? What are your conclusions based on this? I see how, it's connected with the arguments. That was way more time than I thought I was going to spend, way more money than I wanted to lose. I can see how these difficult feelings trigger getting out of control, whatever the client's conclusions are. Yeah, the only day I ended up feeling good was the day that I didn't gamble. Mm-hmm. I think this is going to be harder than I thought. So self-monitoring just to provide self-feedback and information for you as clinician to give some feedback to the client in terms of setting what goals may be workable. So we first get the client's own reaction and really validate any motivational statements that the client is making. I'm really going to have to work hard. Yeah, I appreciate your ability to see that this is going to take some effort. It's not going to happen just because you want it to, but we can work on that. All right. Validating any behaviors in the direction of harm reduction. Clarifying any risks and problems. Boy, that sports bar seems to be a place where you're likely to get out of control. Or when you get frustrated or angry, do you see any connection with gambling excessively with those feelings? And then, what do you think of this summary? What would you like to do next? And this is where we really need to involve family. If there's family, caring others involved, so important, because the countertransference reactions I stated about my anxiety around limited gambling, family members are going to have those too. What? You're going to still keep on after all the trouble this has caused us? So we need to have the family involved to figure out, what are you willing to tolerate, family? What would help your anxiety level? What protections do we need to put into place that can help family members feel safe, not just financially, but emotionally and physically, especially if there's any risk for or history of violence, aggressive behaviors in the family, around gambling activities. So how do we create that safety? And this, clearly we're talking, this isn't going to happen in one session. So we're approaching these goals, with the family, understanding, what makes you feel more at risk? Person with a gambling disorder, how are you going to address creating safety for your family? How, as a family, can we have transparency where there's more honesty about gambling behaviors and more accountability so we all know what's happening? And certainly protecting money protection planning and financial transparency can be absolutely key to working on an abstinence-based as well as a limited gambling approach. These approaches, again, work for abstinence as well as limited gambling. We would do the monitoring in the same way, maybe, not monitoring what you want to set as your limit, but monitoring what are the triggers for any gambling behavior. So we're monitoring how well are you reaching whatever goal it is you set for your gambling behavior, whether it's limited gambling or no gambling whatsoever, and how can we keep learning from that monitoring? Creating safety, this brings us to, well, what are the basic emotional, financial, physical needs of the family? Do we need to set a budget? Do we need to know what the budget is so we know how much money can be spent on gambling without creating harms for the family? So working on limited gambling brings us into all these other domains that are really important to work on in terms of gambling treatment. When you've spent more money on gambling than you set as your goal, how can we work on your frustration so that you don't take it out physically or emotionally on family members? Do we need to do anger management and stress management to allow the family to feel safe if this activity is going to continue? So you see how it branches. We're not getting distracted. It's all coming back to these are other skills to develop in support of a limited gambling goal. And one thing about limited gambling, can it allow us to be more honest as a family? So that you don't feel like, oh, the goal is abstinence, but I want to keep on gambling, so I can't tell anybody about it. If we agree that you're going to gamble in this limited way, can you be more honest about when, how, and to what extent you're gambling so we can help support you in meeting your goals? One way of doing that might be agreement to sit down daily. And everybody reports on, whether they've met their goals in terms of, I agreed I'd support you by making sure the kitchen was cleaned up. And I agreed I would limit my gambling by putting, any extra money into this and going over all the receipts so you could see that I wasn't lying to you about where the money was going. Whatever you agree on in that daily review, and working on honest, courageous, compassionate communication. So then we get to setting limits, so the usual limits are money. How much do you want to bet? How much do you set as a loss limit? How much do you set as your win limit? When I win so much, that's when I stop. I don't keep going. Time, how many days a week? How many hours per episode? Are there certain days of the week that I will or won't gamble, or certain times of day? What are my low risk types of gambling or high risk forms of gambling? I'll only gamble on the lottery. I won't go to the casino. So there are a lot of ways we can set limits, not just in terms of money. Are there other activities that I want to monitor and limit? Like, I can only watch baseball games. I can't watch football games. I may not be able to golf at all. Whatever those limitations may be. Places, I won't go to the sports bar. I won't place in-game bets. I'll only bet on the result of whole games. And I won't gamble when I'm angry. Or I won't gamble when I'm feeling lonely, or whatever those emotional states or other circumstances might be. So we go through that whole gamut of where are we going to be setting limits. And then just a brief example is you write it all down. Everything goes in writing. The worse my memory gets, the more I appreciate everything goes in writing, so that my client will remember, so that their concerned others will remember, and there won't be arguments about I didn't say that. And so you just commit it to writing. And then what signs might indicate that you're exceeding your limits? So how do we know if it's working? If I spend more, $20 more than budgeted, if I spend 1 hour more than budgeted, if I gamble one more day than I set limits on, if I start gambling back on sports rather than just the lottery. So we put it all in writing. And then if we notice those warning signs, what are we going to do? Tell my counselor, tell my concerned others, be honest about that, strengthen my money protection plan, take a break from all gambling completely for a while, to regroup, go to a support meeting, whatever those agreements might be. And at the same time, we're limiting or addressing the harms of gambling. We want to look at, are there other ways that we can also build in for you to get the benefits? So gambling isn't the only thing. So you have more options that help if you're going to reduce your gambling or limit your gambling, that you have these other things you can do when you don't want to be gambling. And how are we going to do some relief of the financial problems while we're doing this experiment in harm reduction? So how can we reduce the harm that's already accrued? And certainly there are times when abstinence may be appropriate and we need to give feedback. When gambling severity is at the very, very extreme of the extreme, when they meet, all 9 of the DSM symptoms, when there are legal difficulties, when they've made attempts in the past to moderate their gambling without any success. If they're going into a residential program where part of the rules are you don't gamble while you're in the treatment program. If there's a mandate by the criminal justice system or the employer, again, it's very pragmatic. You're going to lose your job per your employer if they find out you've been gambling on anything. Maybe a good idea to give it a break for a while. And when I deal with clients with legal cases, and sometimes they're still gambling when they come in for an evaluation, I say, look, it's not going to look good to the court if they find out you're still gambling. They're going to think you're not taking this seriously. So it's in your own best interest, at least while you're being processed through this legal quagmire, to just not gamble. When relationships are at risk, or for the peace of mind of partners, If the partner says, no, I'm out of here, if you're gambling at all, I just can't deal with that, then you have to consider that seriously and maybe think about, what do you want more? And I've had clients who've gone both ways. No, I'd rather keep gambling, and no, the relationship is more important. And research certainly supports that individuals seeking help have pretty good insight when selecting limited gambling or abstinence as a goal based on their gambling severity ratings. So research says we can trust our clients' decisions and choices about whether they can do limited gambling or not. Or whether, and certainly their choices about, no, I really need to abstain from gambling. And many clients working on limited gambling or moderation, as they progress in that, decide it's too hard, it's not worth it. But we're not working with them in a bait and switch, saying, well, I'll just hang in there until you decide you can't do it. We're giving our best effort to help them limit their gambling. But the research suggests that it is pretty hard to maintain, and many clients do end up choosing an abstinence-based goal. And we've talked about some of the disadvantages. Let me play a quick snippet of James here. And just, if I could get it to play. Think about.
And John lives in my sister's basement.
Pretty messy. This is actually cleaner than it has been.
It reeks. When it rains, it floods.
As you can see, the floor is wet. It's pretty disgusting.
It is a dilapidated, terrible place.
I can't believe anybody would be happy and content living down there.
John has a complete safety net in my parents' home.
My sister is absolutely enabling him.
Mom cooks and cleans for him, washes his clothes. Dad takes him to the bar, gives him spending money, provides him with gambling money. The list is endless.
John is completely broke and unable to provide for these babies. John sold the car last week. He said he needed a bigger car for his family, but instead John went and gambled the money away. This man needs to get a job, stop freeloading, and start being responsible for those children.
He doesn't have any motivation to work. Why would he? He has the world handed to him at my parents' home. John lives in a deep black hole where it's him and him only.
This is definitely where I spend most of my time. It's isolating myself from my problems.
John treats
A picture of this situation. So think about James and what would you do and how would you feel if he shows up in your office and said, look, I know I'm in a bad place, but I really don't want to stop gambling. I think it's my only way out of this situation, but I don't want to keep losing money and causing all this harm. Can you help me? That's a tough one. That's a tough one, My stomach would be churning. If the situation is, look, I'm not going to engage in treatment unless we work on my goal of limited gambling. Is it better to work on that with James, or better say, well, sorry, I can't do that. You're going to have to go out and hit a lower bottom. So we get into some ethical issues here. I certainly, you could probably tell James, as we've talked about, I think it's going to be really difficult for you to stick to limited gambling? Is that consistent with what your experience has already told you? You've been trying to limit your gambling on your own for quite some time. And then we could go into, what have you already tried? Has anything worked? So we could start eliminating things he's already tried. Have you tried protecting some of the money so that some of whatever money you have now, clearly some other options of getting money? Can we do both things at once, James? Can you get a job and still gamble in a limited way? So that you're reducing the harm to other members of your family that you care about. So you're not stealing from other family members. So you're not borrowing from other family members. And that's where we really have to work with the family to be very fiercely compassionate and be able to say no to James and get everybody on the same page. This is one of those situations where, whether he's working on limiting his gambling or trying to please everybody by saying, no, I'm not going to gamble at all because that's what you guys want me to say, I'm still likely to sneak some gambling in there because it's the only thing that gives me hope. So we have to acknowledge that James needs some hope. And be supportive of that. And maybe hope that, your wife and children still want you to be part of the family. But there are some things you have to do to help them feel safe and supported. So helping the family remain supportive and non-judgmental of James without reinforcing his gambling behaviors. And helping James build some alternatives to slowly have the things he wants in his life that he has been, having the belief that gambling might supply. So feel free to chat in any comments about James. And I know we're running out of time.
My mom.
So when we talk about, that's kind of a quick view of working with clients, individual clients and families. When we look at at-risk groups, we have evidence that, we need to address this issue in folks in substance use treatment. And creating a big umbrella, because not everybody in substance use treatment has a gambling problem. Some can gamble well, some, have a problem. And they're going to get me the hook here in a minute. And we have to allow for people to gamble in ways that they think will be adding to their recovery. There is some data on normative feedback, how much the average American or Canadian loses. And so if you're doing more than that, you may want to look at that in terms of percentages, in terms of absolute amounts. And for example, 22% of people who gamble daily report negative consequences. So if you're gambling daily, that might be leading to problems. And budgeting guidelines, how much you should put towards each of these areas. Defining low and high risk gambling for each individual. And you don't just feed these to clients. So if I do a substance use group, I ask them, how would you define low risk gambling? How would you define high-risk gambling? Did you ever know anybody who had a gambling problem? What did that look like? Are there any risky situations for you where you might gamble too much? And what are your goals in life or recovery? And how will gambling help you meet those goals? Or how might gambling interfere with those goals? So when we're working with at-risk groups, we're not giving them the problem gambling lecture. We're helping them think through what is the impact of gambling likely to be on your life and recovery. And if it's helping, great, go for it. If there are ways it's detracting from your well-being, then let's see what we can do about that and not create those harms. And what are your goals for gambling in recovery? How would you like to enjoy it? What types of gambling? How often do you think it would be good for you to gamble? How much money can you afford? So it's always setting the parameters for individuals, either if they already have a problem or they're in a risk group. And what would be your warning signs to let you know that gambling is becoming more of a problem in your life? Increasing gambling behaviors, cravings for other addictive behaviors, using gambling as an alternative to other addictive behaviors, to relieve unpleasant feelings, to get the same kind of rush or high that I did with other addictive behaviors, and so forth. And then always have a plan. And this brings us around to the public health approach that we started out talking about, recognizing how we need to address a person's environment to reduce the potential for gambling harms. And I love this. This author talks about ethical gambling, that the responsibility of companies, of the industry, and governments is to create environments that are conducive to reducing gambling harm. And we're nowhere near that. That companies and governments that are making money off of gambling have a moral obligation to take actions to prevent the harm of this activity. Ethical gambling develops environmental conditions that allow gambling to be an economic activity with the emphasis on preventing harm. Preventing harm comes first, economic activity and profits come second. And I know that puts me in, an idealized world, but I'll keep saying it. But that's the ideal we're shooting for. All right. And thank you very much. Only 2 minutes overtime. Thank you all very much for hanging in there.